An early 19th century description tells us this of Basingstoke. The town is represented to be gradually increasing in size and importance. It contains no manufacturing but is a place of very great thoroughfare and is situated in the centre of a rich agricultural district. The markets held here are well attended, being resorted to by persons from Andover, Winchester, Newbury and Reading. A market has been held in Basingstoke for more than 1,000 years and today provides a continuous link with the town's distant past. But there was another aspect of old Basingstoke that would prove more significant to the town's future. This is an entry in the 1826 edition of Pigot's Directory. The town of Basingstoke lies at the point where the two high roads from Winchester and Salisbury unite on their way to London. Basingstoke is situated 45 miles from London, and its trade and commerce is much increased by its proximity thereto. It is the principal thoroughfare to all parts of the southwest of England. So even then, nearly 200 years ago, London was a factor in the town's development. In those days, though, the influence of the capital was restricted by the slow pace of travel. Monk's Basingstoke coach left Basing Lane in London at 8:45 each morning and took 6 hours to reach Basingstoke. The journey from London to Southampton took 8 hours, and London to Salisbury 14 hours. In the heyday of the coaching era, around 50 stagecoaches passed through Basingstoke every day. Busy coaching inns provided meals and accommodation for travellers and stabling for the relays of horses required for the reliable operation of the coaches. The principal inns lay on or near the main London road, which was the bustling hub of the town. London Street, Winchester Street and the old marketplace were clamorous with the rattle of wheels and harnesses, blaring coach horns, the clatter of hooves and the shouts of coachmen. But great change was in the wind. Britain was in the grip of a new transport revolution. On the 25th of July, 1834, Parliament passed an Act for the construction of the London to Southampton Railway, which would pass directly through Basingstoke. The line was completed on the 11th of May, 1840, and the Hampshire Advertiser describes the grand opening. The opening of the London and Southampton Railway from the Southampton end of the line to Winchester and the other portion of the line to Basingstoke took place on Monday last with such praise that the most anxious friends of this great undertaking had not anticipated. The first train set off at 7:30, drawn by the powerful engine Pegasus. Presently the engine made a loud hiss. Clouds of smoke issued from its netted mouth. Showers of fire fell on the road beneath. Its huge limbs began to move, slowly at first, as if feeling her way. Then quicker, the shrill rumbling sound was heard amidst the enthusiastic cheering of thousands of spectators, and the delighted passengers found themselves speeding along at a rate exceeding 30 miles an hour. Writing as we do for an extensive country circulation where acquaintance with railway travelling has been, in a great measure, only known from hearsay, we shall be excused for mentioning that travelling inside of a first-class coach on the railway is in every respect equal to, and in some respects more comfortable than by the best appointed coach on common roads. On arrival of the first train at Winchester, the Southampton directors proceeded to Basingstoke, where upon every height and at every place where a view could be obtained, groups of admiring spectators were stationed to watch and applaud the progress of the engine and its bulky train upon its maiden journey. The town itself presented the appearance of a holiday. Young and old, rich and poor, gentle and simple, came out in droves to see the train, that unusual visitor, but destined to be no more unusual from that day forth, and promising an increase to their prosperity. In 1848, a second line, sponsored by the Great Western Railway, opened from Basingstoke to Reading, which put the town at the heart of the Southern Rail network. This account, written 30 years later, shows the impact of the railways on the town. Basingstoke is of still greater importance as a thoroughfare, since the London and South Western and Great Western Railways have their junction here. This has been the cause of the great increase in the population of the town, from 4,000 to nearly 9,000. In the spring of 1881, the growing town of Basingstoke was in a state of great anxiety, the cause of which was a rather unlikely one. The year before, the Salvation Army had come to Basingstoke for the first time. They took over a disused silk mill in Brook Street, known as the Factory, which became their local headquarters. From here, they announced they would open fire on sin and Satan. But their methods jarred with many townsfolk, as this letter to the Basingstoke Gazette reveals. The peculiar mode adopted by the Salvation Army for bringing their views before the public, enticing recruits to join their ranks, is not likely to commend itself to people at large. The majority of us prefer a religion which does not strive, nor cry, nor let its voice be heard too freely in the streets, and processions of an army singing hymns more or less pointed at the prevalent vices of the neighbourhood are looked upon as nuisances. Other protests were more direct. On one occasion, for example, when the Salvation Army band played in the marketplace, a butcher rang a bell throughout the performance. But the Salvationists were determined to save the sinners of Basingstoke. The sinners of Basingstoke, though, didn't want to be saved, and grew increasingly irritated. The town's publicans were particularly annoyed. Basingstoke was well known for its brewing and was full of public houses, so the prospect of abstinence from the demon drink wasn't exactly popular. The reaction of the townsfolk to the Salvation Army grew increasingly hostile. Things came to a head on Sunday, the 27th of March, 1881. This is the account of the day's events from the Gazette. After it had been definitely decided that the Salvation Army would again parade the streets on Sunday, whispers were afloat that great preparations were being made by the opposition authorities. The excitement was doubly increased when it was found that a battery of the Royal Horse Artillery, who were on the march, would spend Sunday in the town. The men received strict orders that they were not to mix themselves up in the affair. Further precautions were taken for the prevention of a disturbance with the appointment of more than 100 special constables, who were sworn in on Saturday morning. Colonel Pepper and Major Moore of the Salvation Army both arrived in the town on the same day to take command of the army forces. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the procession moved forward singing one of the army's favourite hymns, "There is a fountain filled with blood." The mob contented themselves with howling and trying to drown the singing, an endeavour in which they were scarcely successful. The crowd then dispersed, some to church and chapel, but the greater part to the public houses to plan for the afternoon. After the morning service, Colonel Pepper was accosted by Councillor Tubb, who called out, "We'll give you a bloody good hiding this afternoon," and at the same time gave emphasis to his threat by gesticulation. A meeting of the special constables took place at the town hall, at which several of the specials took exception to their duties on account of having to protect the army. The Salvationists set off again in the afternoon from the factory, but when they reached Church Square, an organised attack was made on the procession. The army's flag was torn and the staff broken into 3 pieces. The marchers were beaten with sticks, leaving many covered in blood and one with his arm broken. While the Battle of Church Square raged on, the mayor and the council took refuge behind the locked gates of the brewery. Eventually, the mayor read the Riot Act, and on arriving at the market square, the mob were surprised to find a number of the Royal Horse Artillery in their saddles, and numbers of others galloping up the street to take their places. Having galloped to the end of Winchester Street, they turned back into Church Street, clearing all before them. The riot brought a period of notoriety to Basingstoke. Questions were asked in Parliament about its cause, and one national newspaper described the town as barbarous Basingstoke. The feeling in Basingstoke was rather different. Some of the ringleaders of the riot were sent to Winchester Prison. After serving their sentences, they returned to a hero's welcome and were guests of honour at a banquet in the Corn Exchange. As for the Salvation Army, they still have a base in Basingstoke, and their appearance on the streets is rather less controversial than it once was. The railway revolution that had embraced Basingstoke had left many rural communities isolated, so in 1896 the government passed the Light Railways Act. This greatly reduced the cost and the time it took to construct new railways. The first line authorised under the Act was the Basingstoke and Alton Light Railway. The Basingstoke Gazette described its opening on the 1st of June 1901. The novelty of running passenger trains through countryside unused to such a feature of civilization excited considerable interest in the parishes affected. The first train, which consisted of 2 passenger coaches and a luggage van with 1 or 2 trucks drawn by a capital little engine, was timed to start from the company's platform at Basingstoke at 9:15 a.m. At that time, several tradesmen and others had taken their seats and awaited the sound of the steam whistle, which was to signal their departure for the trial trip into new country. Unfortunately, the line was never profitable, and it closed in 1936. But although its life was short, it became one of the most famous railways in the country. In 1928, it featured in a spectacular train crash with a steam lorry in the film The Wrecker. The highlight of its movie career was as the setting for the film Oh, Mr. Porter, starring Will Hay, which was released in 1937. Shortly after the film was made, the track was taken up for good. On the 28th of June 1914, Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip assassinated the heir to the Austria-Hungary throne, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. In the diplomatic crisis that followed, international alliances were invoked, and within weeks the major powers were at war. On the 4th of August, Britain declared war on the German Empire. At the outbreak of the war, the German army numbered around 4.5 million men, most of them conscripts. The British army was just 975,000 strong, including the regular troops and the territorials. And Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, launched his famous appeal for volunteers. The young men of Basingstoke were quick to answer the call. The willing volunteers filled in their forms and underwent a rudimentary examination, and the process was concluded with the recruit taking the King's shilling. A couple of days later, they received notice of where to report for initial training. Many of Basingstoke's new soldiers, though, soon found themselves back on home soil. A large tented camp was established on Basingstoke Common to act as a transit centre for troops from all over the south of England. From here they marched proudly off, bound for the battlefields of France and Greece, with the patriotic cheers of the crowd ringing in their ears. They soon discovered the horrors of trench warfare, and the pages of the Gazette carried regular reports of young Basingstoke men who would never see their hometown again. Among them was Ernest Fitzgerald, one of Kitchener's new army, who joined the 12th Hampshires in November 1916. In March 1917 he wrote to his wife, Lemmy, "Do not worry about me as I'm A1 at present. I don't know, but they say it will be all over next month. Hope so. Please send me a copy of the Gazette, a packet of Woodbine cigarettes, writing paper, and a nice cake. I remain your loving husband, Ernie. Loving kisses to you and the children." It was the last time Lemmy Fitzgerald heard from her husband. A month later, she received news that he had been killed in the trenches at Salonika. This was just one of the tragic scenes being played out in homes across Basingstoke as the war dragged on for 4 long years. Finally, on the 11th of November 1918, came the news that this terrible conflict was over. The good news that the armistice with Germany had been signed early on Monday morning and that hostilities were to cease at 11 a.m. reached Basingstoke, and at noon the hoisting of the Union Jack on the town hall seemed to signal official confirmation of the glad tidings. Meanwhile, flags and bunting were hung out by shopkeepers and householders. People dropped their work and came out into the streets wearing smiles of joyous exultation. But of course, as the Gazette pointed out, for many local people the joyous news was tinged with deep sadness. Germany has been beaten and surrendered, and the good news brought tears to many eyes, tears of joy and thankfulness, but in too many eyes, tears of sorrow and bereavement, for there are few households in Basingstoke untouched by tragedy. At a public meeting in the town hall on the 28th of January 1919, it was unanimously resolved that a war memorial for Basingstoke should be erected. A meeting in the following May agreed that Golding's, a Georgian house 5 minutes from the town centre, should be purchased along with its 15-acre estate. Thomas Burberry put up the £10,500 to acquire the house and grounds until the council were able to raise sufficient funds, mainly by subscription. By 1921, the loan was repaid and an additional £2,000 raised to commission a war memorial. It was unveiled on Empire Day, the 24th of May, 1923. On Thursday afternoon, the new gateway leading to the War Memorial Park from London Road was opened, and the monument which has been set up within the entrance in honour of the men of Basingstoke who had laid down their lives in the Great War was religiously dedicated. There are 233 names on the memorial, but the true number of local dead was nearer to 600. None of those present at the unveiling ceremony could have imagined that just 16 years later, and 21 years after the end of the Great War, the world would once again plunge headlong into conflict.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
As the Gazette reveals, the people of Basingstoke appear to have taken Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's sombre broadcast in their stride. The news of the outbreak of war was received by most people locally over the wireless on Sunday morning. The grave turn of events during the previous week prepared people for the worst, and after hearing the news, residents of the town went calmly about their ordinary business. But they soon discovered that this war would make carrying on as normal an impossibility. The biggest impact of the early days of the war was the arrival of thousands of young newcomers. The government evacuation scheme for schoolchildren began last Friday and was expeditiously carried out. Basingstoke Borough Rural District and Kingsclere and Whitchurch Rural District were reception areas for people evacuated from Portsmouth and Southampton. The Minister of Health had informed the local committee that they might have to find accommodation for up to 4,000 persons. The first train arrived at 10:30 a.m. on Friday, being about a quarter of an hour late because one child pulled the communication cord. It contained 372 children and 45 adults, and had left Portsmouth at 8 a.m. The children assembled on the station platform in an orderly manner and passed through a wire barrier from the station to the cattle market. They were given a drink of water and their rations, which included 2 packets of biscuits, 2 tins of condensed milk, and a tin of corned beef. The chief billeting officer said that the reception arrangements went without a hitch, and the whole of the billeting was completed by a comparatively early hour on Saturday evening. One small girl evacuated from Portsmouth while playing in War Memorial Park said that she hoped the war would last a long time as she liked Basingstoke. Although the district was considered a safe haven for evacuees, plans were underway to protect the population, just in case. The Gazette kept the citizens up to date with progress. The Report and Control Centre, established at the municipal offices, is manned throughout the 24 hours. The messenger service, which is now fully manned, has 23 messengers available on call for inter-borough work and 8 dispatch riders with motor cars or cycles for long-distance work. 6 ARP wardens' posts are manned throughout the 24 hours by 18 full-time wardens working in shifts. There has been great activity in sandbagging important buildings such as the hospital, report centre and police station. Many residents will have noticed work proceeding on several air raid shelters in the town. Captain Shepherd, the Borough Assistant ARP officer, told a Gazette reporter that when completed, the public shelters will provide accommodation for 1,000 persons. The authorities decided to put Basingstoke's emergency systems to the test. An important exercise of the ARP services of the borough has been arranged to take part on Saturday, September the 23rd. It is desired to make the conditions as near as possible to those which might obtain in wartime. No details of the plan will be published. Wardens and those in charge of posts and parties will receive information and orders by means as near as possible to wartime conditions. After the initial flurry of activity, nothing actually happened. The expected air raids hadn't materialized, and the population began to wonder what all the fuss had been about. The mood changed in May 1940. The German blitzkrieg had seen Hitler's stormtroopers sweep through France. By the end of May, the British Expeditionary Force, which had gone to France to support the French army, were pinned down on the beaches of Dunkirk. As the might of the German military machine massed across the Channel, Britain prepared for the inevitable invasion. Southern towns were particularly vulnerable, and concrete pillboxes, anti-tank defences and roadblocks sprang up around Basingstoke. Another important feature of the home defences were the local defence volunteers, later renamed the Home Guard. Local men who were too young or too old to join the regular army volunteered in their droves to defend their hometown against the Nazi threat. The local Home Guard units became a regular sight in training on the Common. But there was trouble in the ranks. The self-appointed commander was Viscount Lymington, whose political leanings were dubious, to say the least. In 1938, he jointly founded the British Council Against European Commitments, which was against war with Germany and supported fascism and anti-Semitism. His co-founder was William Joyce, who later fled to Germany and, as Lord Haw-Haw, broadcast anti-British propaganda. The Viscount was accused of being a Nazi sympathizer and was asked to step down as a Home Guard commander. He refused, but was forcibly removed by the commander for Hampshire. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940. Although Basingstoke wasn't a direct target, its proximity to London and Southampton, which both took a pounding, meant that local people soon became familiar with the sight and sound of airborne terror. From time to time, a stray enemy bomber dropped its deadly payload on Basingstoke, but the town's worst incident of the war came on the 16th of August, 1940. Late in the afternoon, the air raid warning sounded yet again. It had become so common that many people simply carried on with their daily routine. Then, a tight group of about 10 German planes swooped out of the clouds and flew low over the town. People watched in horror as the planes released their lethal payload. A minute later, a series of explosions shook the town centre. The scene in Church Square, which had suffered the brunt of the attack, was one of utter devastation. Many of the historic houses opposite the church had been destroyed, and the windows of St. Michael's Church had been blown out. "11 people died in the Church Square raid. The war had come to Basingstoke, and its citizens suddenly became very nervous. Some of them decided to take no chances and moved to more remote areas like Winklebury. A small shanty town grew up here, made up of temporary homes that were little more than shacks, and even a few disused railway carriages. By 1944, the war was turning in favour of the Allies, and in early June, the coastal towns of Hampshire were a frenzy of activity in preparation for the D-Day assault on France.
From the coast of Britain, the floodgates are opening to release the tide of Allied soldiers. A great curtain of secrecy is still drawn as invasion troops embark, and our Prime Minister makes a last-minute visit to the assembled armada. The first of a series of landings in force is how Mr. Churchill describes the operation. Author of the Victory V sign, he watches over the great preparations. While all this is going on, there goes out to Europe by radio the warnings issued by Supreme Headquarters. The alert is sounded not only in France, but in Norway, Belgium and Holland. The underground movements are given instructions, and to the people of France, there comes the voice of the Supreme Commander, General Eisenhower. Eagerly they absorb every line of the rationed information as it comes to hand. The news is good, far better than they dared to hope. Cheers bridged the English Channel. Britons, impatient for the official signal to celebrate, jumped the starting gun on Monday night. And for days afterwards, Londoners packed city streets and squares.
Basingstoke shared in the great national outburst of thanksgiving and rejoicing on VE Day and the end of hostilities in Europe announced by the Prime Minister at 3 p.m. on Tuesday. At that hour, a vast concourse of people, civilians and members of British and Allied forces assembled in the town square and listened to Mr. Churchill's broadcast speech.
This is your victory. Victory of the cause of freedom is everywhere. In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this.
Children's tea parties, dancing and bonfires, all in the streets. That was the way in which the Allies' victory of the Nazis was celebrated on Tuesday and Wednesday in every town in the neighborhood. In addition, there were gay decorations on every side, and unexceptionally, the smaller and poorer the street, the more profuse the flags. With the celebrations over, the nation began the process of rebuilding. One of the most pressing problems was the severe shortage of houses caused by the Blitz. One solution was the construction of prefabricated homes, and in June 1945, the first prefabs were erected in Basingstoke. The first of the prefabricated houses has arrived at Sands Road, Basingstoke. Much thought has been put into the design and construction of these homes to give the maximum convenience and efficiency. The construction work has been entrusted to the well-known firm of Basingstoke building contractors, H.J. Goodall and Son Limited. In June 1951, the people of Basingstoke gathered in War Memorial Park to watch a colourful historic pageant depicting scenes from the town's past. Romans, Anglo-Saxons, medieval kings and queens, the coming of the railway, and the advent of the motor car age were all represented, along with a little-known event in Basingstoke's history: the invasion by dancing Red Indians. The pageant was part of the Festival of Britain, which was organised by the government to banish the gloom of the war years, a concept that was embraced wholeheartedly in Basingstoke. As the crowds enjoyed the pageant, negotiations were already underway that would write a new chapter in Basingstoke's history. In October 1961, an agreement was signed between Basingstoke Borough Council, Hampshire County Council and London County Council to include the town in the London Overspill Plan. Basingstoke was officially designated an expanding town. Within 20 years, its population would increase almost fourfold, from 26,000 to 100,000, and the town centre and its rural hinterland would be transformed. The authorities wasted no time in starting the process, and on the 28th of June 1962, the Gazette announced the first major development of the new town. Promptly at 12:30 p.m. yesterday, a red Wiltshire and Dorset 101 double-decker bus pulled out of the new bus station in Woke Street, which was built on the site of the old canal wharf. It was the first one to leave the bus station, which was opened by the Mayor, Councillor J.B. Peat, a few moments earlier. It was an historic occasion, the first of many new developments which are in store for Basingstoke. Further changes followed thick and fast, and much of old Basingstoke disappeared beneath concrete, bricks and mortar.
The sweet, sweet memories you gave me, you can't beat the memories you gave me.
Take one fresh and tender kiss,
The memories you gave me.
add one stolen night of bliss.
Can't beat the memories you gave me.
One girl, one boy, some grief, some joy, memories are made of this.
The memories you gave me.
Don't forget a small moonbeam,
Can't beat the memories you gave me.
fold in lightly with a dream.
The memories you gave me.
Your lips and mine, two sips of wine, memories are made of this.
The memories you gave me.
Then add the wedding bells, one house where lovers dwell, three little kids for the flavor. Stir carefully through the days, see how the flavor stays. These are the dreams you will savor with His blessings from above.
Can't beat the memories you gave me.
Serve it generously with love.
While a new Basingstoke took shape, a firm that had played an important part in the town's industrial heritage closed its factory gates for good. The Thornycroft Steam Wagon Company had set up its new factory in Worthing Road in 1898. The Thornycroft Steam Wagon Company had set up its new factory in Worthing Road in 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. 1898. Here it produced steam lorries and vans, dabbled for a time in the production of motor cars, and during the First World War produced more than 5,000 military vehicles. After that, it concentrated on goods vehicles and buses. At its peak, 1,500 people were employed at the Basingstoke works, and its closure in 1972 was a huge blow to the town. As one aspect of the area's industrial heritage was consigned to history, another was being resurrected. The Basingstoke Canal was completed in 1794 to connect the town with London via the rivers Wey and Thames. Timber, flour and chalk were the principal cargoes to London, and barges returned with coal and fertiliser. But the undertaking was never profitable, and commercial carrying gradually dwindled. The last working boat reached Basingstoke in 1910, bringing 10 tons of moulding sand for the agricultural engineers Wallace and Stevens. After this, the only regular traffic were pleasure barges, running day-long picnic trips, complete with entertainment, and skiffs and punts that could be hired from the yard of A.J. Harmsworth. By the 1950s, the canal was virtually derelict. But in 1966, the Surrey and Hampshire Canal Society was formed by a group of local canal enthusiasts with the ambitious goal of restoring it. Slowly, very slowly, but surely, the Basingstoke Canal was brought back to life, and on the 10th of May 1991, 32 miles of the canal, from Weybridge to Greywall, were formally reopened. The last 5 miles to Basingstoke, though, presents rather more of a challenge. A section of the canal bed at Hatch was filled in during construction of the M3, and the canal terminus was replaced in the 1960s by Basingstoke Bus Station, and now lies beneath Festival Place. But this end of the navigation hasn't been entirely forgotten. A canal heritage footpath and cycleway closely follows its course from Festival Place to Old Basing and leads to the surviving fragments of the lost waterway. Redbridge Lane carried the roadway over the canal on its approach to Old Basing. The Red Bridge itself was constructed of local red bricks, hence its name, and its restored parapets can still be seen. A little further on is a more substantial remnant of the navigation. Basing House Bridge was left standing because it forms an attractive part of the driveway to Basing House. Despite the huge challenge presented by restoring the last 5 miles, it remains the long-term aim of the Canal Society to reinstate the whole length of the navigation. With so much of Old Basingstoke lost to the expanding town, what was left became even more precious. So when the developers' focus moved to the ancient common, there was a public outcry. The common had been part of town life since time immemorial. From early times, each tenant of the lord of the manor had customary rights, which allowed them to collect firewood and graze livestock on the common land. The number of animals per household, legs on the common as it was known, was calculated according to the value of their property, and the common could accommodate up to 280 animals. As this story from the Hampshire Advertiser in September 1832 shows, common rights were still taken up. Our neighbourhood has of late been infested by a notorious gang of gypsy horse stealers. 2 horses have been stolen from Basingstoke Common, one belonging to Mr. T. Taylor, butcher of Church Street, and the other belonging to Mr. Tamlin, supervisor of excise. The Common also served as the venue for a wide range of leisure pursuits. This selection of items from the Hampshire Advertiser gives an idea of the kind of activities that once took place here. The new landlord of the White Hart Inn is fully determined to keep up the old charter and intends engaging a band to attend on Basingstoke Common on the White Hart Club Feast Day. The return match of cricket between Basingstoke and Newbury will be played on Monday next on Basingstoke Common. There was a meeting at the Red Lion Inn on Thursday evening to make arrangements for the re-establishment of Basingstoke races. The next meeting will be held on Basingstoke Common on Thursday next, when we trust that the Friends of the Turf will attend. A pigeon match came off on Basingstoke Common on Tuesday for a fat hog weighing 30 score. Mr. Henry Freer and Mr. Page were the only gentlemen who killed all their birds, although the whole of the party shot uncommonly well. A rabbit coursing meeting took place on Tuesday on the Basingstoke Common, which was largely attended by the lovers of the sport. No wonder the townsfolk were up in arms in 1965 when 85 acres of the common were earmarked for residential development. The storm of protest played a part in the plan being abandoned. Some encroachment, though, has taken place. An extension to the Harriet Costello School, a new hotel, and new roads to link with the M3 motorway have all nibbled away at the old common. The lost acres were replaced with land a little to the east, bordering Old Basing, and residents of modern Basingstoke will no doubt be relieved to discover that they still have the right to graze their cattle here. It's good to know that, despite all the changes that have overtaken Basingstoke, some vestiges of the past have survived the passage of time.